Have you ever noticed that the question about the meaning of life doesn't appear when everything is falling apart, but when everything seems to be working just fine? And have you ever wondered why, even with stability, direction, and effort, something inside can still feel unfinished? We move into the question of meaning through Carl Jung's way of seeing the inner life, not as something to solve, but as something that slowly reveals itself over time. If you feel drawn to this kind of slow, inward exploration, consider subscribing and continuing the journey. Chapter 1. When the question appears in silence. Most people believe the question of meaning arrives during moments of collapse, when something has gone wrong, when life has clearly failed to deliver what was promised. But Carl Jung observed something far more unsettling, which is that the question usually appears when life is functioning exactly as it should, when routines are in place, responsibilities are being met, and the external structure feels stable enough that it no longer demands constant attention. It begins quietly, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a faint inner resistance that shows up in pauses between tasks, in the strange emptiness that appears at the end of the day, in the realization that time is passing without leaving much of an imprint behind. And because nothing is obviously broken, the feeling is easy to dismiss, easy to label as boredom, fatigue, or temporary dissatisfaction, even though it continues to return with increasing persistence. Jung understood this discomfort as a psychological signal rather than a problem, because when the psyche has outgrown the form of life it is inhabiting, it does not announce this growth with clarity or confidence, but with unease, with restlessness, with the sense that one's own life is being observed rather than lived, as though the individual is present for their own existence but not fully inside it. At this stage, people often search for external explanations, assuming the issue must lie in circumstances, in relationships, in work, or in some missing achievement. And so they attempt to adjust the surface of their lives, believing that a new goal, a different environment, or a revised identity will resolve the tension. Yet the unease remains, because the source of the discomfort is not external dissatisfaction, but internal misalignment. Jung believed that meaning does not disappear suddenly, nor does it collapse under pressure, but instead slowly drains away when a person continues to live according to patterns that once protected them but no longer reflect who they are becoming. And because these patterns were often adopted unconsciously, inherited from family, culture, or necessity, the individual may not even realize that their current life is based on an earlier psychological stage that has already passed. What makes this moment particularly confusing is that the persona, the socially acceptable mask that allows a person to function in the world, is usually at its strongest when meaning begins to weaken, because competence, reliability, and adaptability can carry a life forward for years without ever requiring the deeper self to participate. And from the outside, everything appears fine, sometimes even admirable. Internally, however, something begins to withdraw, not dramatically, but subtly, through a loss of emotional depth, a dulling of curiosity, or a growing sense that one's actions are no longer connected to an inner necessity. And Jung saw this withdrawal not as pathology, but as the psyche refusing to invest energy in a life that has stopped evolving. This is why the question of meaning rarely sounds like a question at first, because it does not ask, it presses, it lingers, it waits, and it often emerges most clearly in silence, when distraction fades and the mind is no longer occupied with performance, leaving space for the unspoken awareness that something essential is being postponed. Jung believed that this moment should not be rushed past or immediately resolved, because meaning does not respond well to force or urgency, and the attempt to suppress the question often intensifies it, turning quiet unease into anxiety, irritability, or a vague sense of inner disconnection that has no obvious cause. The danger, Jung warned, is not in asking what life means, but in ignoring the moment when the question first appears. Because when the psyche is not listened to, it does not fall silent. It finds other ways to express itself, through exhaustion, through emotional numbness, through symptoms that seem unrelated, but all point back to the same source, which is a life being lived without inner participation. In this sense, the appearance of the question is not a sign of confusion, weakness, or failure, but an indication that the individual is standing at the edge of psychological development, even if they do not yet know what that development requires. Because meaning, in Jung's view, does not come from answers, but from the willingness to remain present with the question long enough for the deeper self to begin speaking. Chapter 2. A life that no longer fits. There comes a moment, often unnoticed at first, when the life a person is living begins to feel slightly misaligned, not in a way that causes immediate pain or visible dysfunction, but in a quieter way that expresses itself as friction, as a subtle resistance to routines that once felt natural, and as a growing sense that effort is being applied in the right places for reasons that are no longer entirely clear. Carl Jung understood this moment as a psychological transition rather than a personal failure, because the human psyche does not remain static once adulthood is reached. Even though society often behaves as if maturity is a finished state rather than an ongoing process, and when inner development continues while outer life remains unchanged, tension inevitably begins to build. At first, this tension is easy to rationalize, because the mind prefers familiar explanations, telling itself that fatigue is the issue, or that motivation has temporarily declined, or that a different goal will restore energy, and so the individual may respond by working harder, by optimizing routines, or by adjusting external circumstances, all while missing the deeper signal that something more fundamental is shifting beneath the surface. Jung observed that many people continue living according to psychological structures that were formed earlier in life, structures that once served an essential purpose, such as gaining approval, achieving security, or avoiding conflict. And these structures can remain effective long after their original necessity has passed, which is precisely what makes them difficult to question. A career chosen to satisfy expectations can still provide income and status. A relationship entered for safety can still offer stability, and a personality shaped to be acceptable can still function smoothly in social settings. Yet none of these guarantees that the inner life feels engaged, alive, or invested in what is unfolding. When this misalignment deepens, the individual may begin to experience a strange contradiction, where life feels simultaneously full and empty, busy yet stagnant, as if motion is happening without direction. And Jung saw this not as confusion, but as a signal that the psyche is no longer willing to pour energy into patterns that no longer reflect its current stage of development. This is often the point at which people describe feeling as though they are playing a role rather than inhabiting their life, performing competence, responsibility, or success without feeling internally connected to what those roles require. And because the performance is convincing, both to others and to themselves, the sense of disconnection can persist for years without being named. Jung believed that meaning cannot survive indefinitely inside a life that has stopped evolving. Because meaning is not generated by repetition or efficiency, but by movement toward greater psychological wholeness. And when that movement is blocked, even a well-constructed life begins to feel narrow. What makes this stage particularly difficult is that nothing external demands change. And without external pressure, the inner call can be easily ignored, dismissed as ingratitude or weakness, leading the individual to double down on the very structures that are causing the tension, believing that discipline or perseverance will resolve what is actually a developmental impasse. Over time, however, the psyche becomes less subtle, and what begins as restlessness may deepen into chronic dissatisfaction, emotional flatness, or a vague sense of resentment toward a life that once felt chosen. And Jung emphasized that this resentment is not directed at circumstances themselves, but at the self for continuing to live in a way that no longer feels internally true. This is the moment when people often ask why motivation has disappeared, why interests have faded, or why achievements feel strangely hollow. And Jung would say that motivation has not vanished, but withdrawn, because the psyche refuses to energize a life that no longer reflects its deeper direction. Importantly, Jung did not see this withdrawal as something to be corrected immediately, because forcing enthusiasm back into an outdated structure only deepens the split between outer life and inner reality, increasing exhaustion rather than resolving it. And instead, he viewed this phase as an invitation to pause, to observe, and to begin questioning assumptions that were previously taken for granted. A life that no longer fits does not collapse all at once, because it is held together by habit, identity, and external reinforcement. But its inner foundations slowly erode, and the person may begin to sense that continuing forward without reflection will eventually require a kind of emotional numbness that comes at a high psychological cost. Jung believed that this stage is unavoidable for anyone who continues to develop beyond early adulthood, because growth eventually demands that previously unconscious choices be brought into awareness, and that roles adopted for survival be examined for relevance, even if they are still socially rewarded. The discomfort that arises here is not meant to push a person away from their life, but to pull them deeper into it, toward a more conscious relationship with why they live the way they do, and toward a recognition that meaning cannot be maintained through momentum alone. In this sense, a life that no longer fits is not a mistake, but a threshold. And although it often feels disorienting and lonely, Jung saw it as the point at which a person is given the opportunity to move from living according to external structures toward living in dialogue with their inner reality, even if that dialogue begins in uncertainty rather than clarity. The danger lies not in standing at this threshold, but in refusing to acknowledge it. Because when a person continues to inhabit a life that has become psychologically too small, the cost is paid in diminished vitality, reduced imagination, and a growing sense that time is passing without transformation, which Jung believed was one of the most corrosive experiences the psyche can endure. Chapter 3. The masks we learn to wear. Long before a person begins to wonder about meaning, long before the question even has language, something else has already taken shape quietly and efficiently, which is the version of the self that knows how to function in the world without causing friction, without drawing unwanted attention, and without risking rejection. A version Carl Jung called the persona, not as an insult, but as a psychological necessity. The persona is not false in the sense of being fake or dishonest, because it is built for survival, not deception. And from early life it forms in response to very real conditions, such as what earns approval, what avoids punishment, what keeps peace and what allows belonging, meaning that the persona is often intelligent, adaptive, and effective long before it is ever questioned. A child learns quickly which parts of themselves are welcomed and which parts create tension. And without conscious deliberation, they begin to emphasize certain traits while quietly suppressing others. Not because they want to lie about who they are, but because they want to remain connected, safe, and seen. And this selective presentation becomes the foundation of a social identity that feels natural precisely because it developed gradually. Over time, the persona grows more refined, shaped by school, work, relationships, and culture, until it becomes indistinguishable from the self in everyday experience. And by adulthood, most people are not aware that they are wearing a mask at all, because the mask has done its job so well that it feels like the face beneath it. Jung observed that the persona often reaches its peak effectiveness just as the inner sense of meaning begins to weaken, because the more competent, reliable, and socially acceptable a person becomes, the less the deeper psyche is required to participate, and life can continue smoothly on the surface, even as something essential remains uninvolved. This is why people who are admired, respected, or successful are not immune to inner emptiness, because admiration strengthens the persona rather than the self, reinforcing the idea that the way one appears is more important than the way one experiences life internally. And the reward structure of society rarely encourages deeper questioning, as long as performance remains consistent. The danger, Jung believed, is not in having a persona, because no one can function socially without one, but in identifying with it completely, because when a person believes that their mask is their whole self, everything outside that role begins to feel threatening, unnecessary, or irrelevant, including emotions, desires, and impulses that do not fit the established image. As identification deepens, the individual may begin to experience a narrowing of inner life, not because they lack depth, but because depth has been quietly set aside in favor of predictability. And the more energy invested in maintaining the persona, the less energy remains available for exploration, spontaneity, or inner dialogue. Jung noticed that people often defend their persona fiercely, not because it is authentic, but because it has become essential to their sense of stability, meaning that any challenge to the role feels like a challenge to existence itself, and this defensiveness can show up as rigidity, irritability, or an unwillingness to reflect on why certain choices were made in the first place. What makes this especially complex is that the persona often appears morally positive, because it is associated with responsibility, discipline, and social contribution. And questioning it can feel selfish or irresponsible, even when the questioning arises from a genuine inner need for growth rather than rebellion. Over time, however, the cost of over-identification becomes harder to ignore, because the psyche does not remain silent indefinitely, and what begins as mild dissatisfaction can slowly deepen into emotional flatness, loss of imagination, or a sense that life is being executed rather than lived, as though one is constantly meeting expectations without ever meeting oneself. Jung believed that when meaning fades, it is often because the persona has become too dominant, crowding out the parts of the psyche that do not serve immediate function or social reward, such as vulnerability, contradiction, curiosity, and unexpressed desire, all of which are essential to a sense of inner aliveness. At this stage, people often feel trapped by their own competence, because the very skills that allowed them to build a stable life now prevent them from questioning it. And the fear of disrupting what works can be stronger than the discomfort of inner emptiness, leading to a kind of psychological stalemate, where change feels risky and stagnation feels suffocating. Jung did not suggest abandoning the persona, because that would be unrealistic and destructive. But he emphasized the importance of recognizing it as a role rather than a total identity, because meaning can only return when a person begins to differentiate between who they are and what they have learned to be. This differentiation is rarely dramatic, because it does not begin with action, but with awareness, with noticing where behavior feels automatic rather than chosen, where reactions feel rehearsed rather than genuine, and where one's life seems guided more by expectation than by inner necessity. As awareness grows, the individual may begin to sense that certain parts of themselves have been left behind, not because they were unworthy, but because they did not fit the role that ensured belonging. And this realization can be unsettling, because it raises the question of how much of one's life has been shaped by adaptation rather than choice. Jung believed that meaning begins to reappear not when the persona is destroyed, but when it is placed in relationship with the deeper self, allowing life to be lived with both social competence and inner honesty, even if that balance feels unstable at first. The mask, once seen as a mask, no longer needs to carry the entire weight of identity. And when that weight is redistributed, the psyche regains some of its freedom to explore, to feel, and to question without immediately needing answers. In this way, the recognition of the persona is not a rejection of one's past, but an invitation to expand beyond it, because a life lived entirely behind a mask may function well, but it cannot feel meaningful for long. And Jung believed that meaning requires more than performance. It requires participation of the whole self, including the parts that never learned how to be acceptable. Chapter 4: What waits behind the persona. Once the persona has carried a person far enough through life, once it has secured stability, belonging, and a recognizable place in the world, something else inevitably begins to make itself known, not loudly and not all at once, but through subtle disturbances that feel out of proportion to their triggers, emotional reactions that seem excessive, irrational, or strangely familiar, as though they belong to a part of the self that has been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. Carl Jung called this neglected territory the shadow, not because it is evil or pathological, but because it exists outside the light of conscious identity, formed from everything that was pushed aside, denied, or deemed unacceptable during the long process of becoming someone who could function, belong, and survive. The shadow is not made of one thing, and this is what makes it difficult to recognize, because it contains both what society labels negative and what it quietly discourages, meaning it holds anger alongside tenderness, selfishness alongside creativity, vulnerability alongside unexpressed strength, all woven together by the simple fact that they did not fit the image the persona was required to maintain. From early life onward, the psyche learned that some impulses receive approval, while others create discomfort, conflict, or rejection. And without conscious intent, the unwanted qualities are pushed into the background, not destroyed, but stored, continuing to exist without a voice, without language, and without direct participation in the life being lived. Jung emphasized that the shadow does not disappear when ignored, because psychological material cannot be erased through neglect, and instead, it accumulates energy over time, influencing behavior indirectly, shaping reactions, preferences, fears, and judgments without ever being acknowledged as part of the self. This is why people often experience strong emotional reactions toward others that seem irrational, because what is rejected internally is often perceived externally, projected onto strangers, partners, leaders, or enemies, allowing the individual to maintain the belief that the unwanted qualities exist only outside themselves. The traits that provoke the strongest reactions are rarely random, because they often reflect precisely what the individual has disowned. Meaning, excessive irritation toward arrogance may mask unacknowledged pride. Moral outrage may conceal unexpressed desire, and contempt for weakness may hide a deep fear of one's own vulnerability. Jung believed that projection is not a moral failure, but a psychological mechanism, because it allows the ego to protect its self-image by relocating inner conflict to the outside world, even though this protection comes at the cost of self-awareness and inner wholeness. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, life tends to feel reactive rather than chosen, because behavior is influenced by forces that operate outside awareness, and meaning begins to erode when a person cannot understand why certain patterns keep repeating despite conscious effort to change. This is often the stage at which people describe feeling divided against themselves, wanting one thing while doing another, reacting in ways they later regret, or feeling driven by impulses that do not align with their values. And Jung saw these experiences not as flaws in character, but as evidence of a psyche that has been split between what is allowed and what is real. The shadow announces itself gradually, often through mistakes, conflicts, dreams, or moments of emotional excess. And because these experiences threaten the carefully maintained image of the self, they are usually met with denial, rationalization, or blame, rather than curiosity. Jung warned that morality alone cannot resolve shadow material, because attempting to suppress unwanted traits through discipline or judgment only strengthens their unconscious influence, pushing them deeper into the psyche, where they operate with even less restraint and less accountability. This is why people who pride themselves on control, discipline, or moral superiority are often the most shocked by their own outbursts, compulsions, or contradictions, because the more rigid the persona becomes, the more pressure builds behind it, and eventually that pressure seeks release. Meaning, in Jung's view, cannot coexist with this kind of internal division indefinitely, because meaning requires participation of the whole psyche, not just the socially acceptable fragments. And when large portions of the self are excluded from conscious life, energy becomes trapped in internal conflict rather than flowing toward growth. The work of encountering the shadow does not begin with action, because action without awareness tends to repeat old patterns, and instead it begins with recognition, with noticing emotional reactions that feel disproportionate, recurring themes in relationships, and patterns of avoidance that persist despite good intentions. Jung believed that the shadow is first met not through understanding, but through humility, because acknowledging the existence of disowned traits requires a willingness to question one's self-image, to accept that the ego's story about who one is has always been incomplete. This encounter often feels destabilizing, not because the shadow is inherently destructive, but because it disrupts the illusion of consistency, revealing that the self is more complex, contradictory, and alive than the persona allowed it to be. And this realization can feel threatening to a life built on predictability. Yet Jung saw this destabilization as necessary, because meaning does not emerge from comfort or certainty, but from the integration of opposites, from holding tension between what one wants to be and what one actually is, without immediately collapsing that tension through judgment or escape. The shadow is not meant to take over conscious life, nor is it meant to be acted out impulsively, because integration does not mean indulgence. And Jung was careful to emphasize that becoming whole does not mean abandoning responsibility or restraint. Instead, integration means allowing the shadow to be known, named, and related to, so that its energy can be transformed rather than suppressed. And when this happens, qualities that once appeared dangerous often reveal their creative potential, because anger becomes assertiveness, vulnerability becomes depth, and ambition becomes purpose. As this process unfolds, meaning begins to return, not as clarity or certainty, but as a sense of inner alignment, because the individual is no longer fighting themselves internally, no longer investing enormous energy in maintaining an image that excludes half of their psychological reality. Life becomes heavier at this stage, not because it becomes worse, but because it becomes more real. And Jung believed that many people mistake lightness for meaning, when in fact meaning often arrives with weight, responsibility, and a deeper awareness of one's own complexity. What waits behind the persona is not a monster, but a fuller version of the self, one that includes contradiction, limitation, and unrealized potential. And although meeting this self can be unsettling, Jung believed it is impossible to live a meaningful life without eventually turning toward it. Because meaning, in the Jungian sense, does not come from being good, successful, or admired, but from becoming whole. And wholeness requires facing what has been hidden, not to eliminate it, but to bring it into relationship with consciousness, where it can finally contribute, rather than sabotage from the shadows. Chapter 5. Meeting the shadow without turning away. There is a moment, subtle but decisive, when a person realizes that the discomfort they have been trying to outrun is not coming from the outside world, not from circumstances, people, or bad luck, but from an internal avoidance that has quietly shaped their reactions for years. And Carl Jung believed that this realization marks the true beginning of psychological confrontation, rather than mere self-reflection. Meeting the shadow does not happen because someone decides to be brave or introspective, but because avoidance eventually becomes more painful than awareness. And the psyche, having exhausted gentler signals, begins to apply pressure through repeated patterns that no longer respond to surface-level adjustments. At this stage, the individual often notices that the same conflicts keep returning in different forms, that relationships follow familiar trajectories, that emotional reactions feel automatic and disproportionate, and that no amount of insight or discipline seems to prevent the repetition, as if something unseen is steering behavior from beneath conscious intention. Jung understood this repetition as meaningful rather than accidental, because what remains unconscious does not dissolve with time, but instead seeks expression through compulsion, drawing the individual back into situations that mirror unresolved inner material, not to punish them, but to force recognition. The instinctive response to these patterns is usually resistance, because the ego prefers explanations that preserve its self-image, and so blame is assigned externally. Narratives are constructed to justify reactions, and responsibility is deflected in subtle ways that allow the individual to remain identified with the persona they have learned to protect. Yet the more carefully these defenses are maintained, the stronger the shadow's influence becomes. Because repression does not weaken psychological content, it concentrates it, giving it autonomy and intensity precisely because it has been denied conscious engagement. Jung warned that the shadow cannot be conquered through force, because force implies opposition, and opposition only strengthens what it seeks to eliminate. Turning the shadow into an adversary rather than a part of the psyche that requires relationship. This is why attempts at moral perfection, relentless self-discipline, or forced positivity often backfire, because they increase the split between the acceptable self and the rejected self, creating an internal imbalance that eventually erupts through behavior that feels out of character yet strangely familiar. Meeting the shadow begins not with correction, but with observation, with the willingness to stay present with uncomfortable reactions without immediately explaining them away, justifying them, or acting them out, allowing them to exist long enough to be seen as psychological material rather than as absolute truths. This process requires patience, because the shadow does not reveal itself all at once, and it rarely appears in a form that matches conscious expectations, instead emerging through irritation, envy, resentment, fantasies, or moments of shame that feel inappropriate given the individual's self-concept. Jung believed that these moments are invitations rather than failures, because each emotional disturbance carries information about a part of the self that has been excluded from conscious life. And ignoring that information only guarantees its return in another form. To meet the shadow without turning away means resisting the urge to immediately label reactions as wrong, immature, or unacceptable, and instead asking what inner need or disowned quality is attempting to make itself known through this response. This is not an intellectual exercise, because the shadow is not accessed through analysis alone, but through emotional honesty, through noticing how the body reacts, where tension accumulates, and which situations reliably provoke disproportionate responses. Jung emphasized that the shadow often contains qualities that the conscious personality prides itself on not having, meaning that a person who identifies as calm may repress anger, someone who values independence may repress need, and someone who sees themselves as rational may repress instinct, resulting in reactions that feel foreign precisely because they contradict the ego's narrative. The danger at this stage is moral collapse, where recognizing the shadow leads to self-condemnation rather than integration, because awareness without compassion can be as destructive as ignorance, turning insight into another weapon against the self. Jung was clear that meeting the shadow does not mean indulging it, because integration is not expression without restraint, but relationship with consciousness, where impulses are acknowledged, understood, and transformed rather than blindly enacted or forcefully suppressed. Transformation occurs when the energy bound up in repression is released from conflict, allowing it to serve conscious aims instead of sabotaging them. And this release often brings unexpected vitality, creativity, and emotional depth that had been absent during years of internal division. At this point, life often begins to feel heavier, not because it becomes worse, but because it becomes more real, as illusions of moral simplicity and personal consistency fall away, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the self as complex, contradictory, and unfinished. Jung believed that many people mistake this heaviness for regression, assuming that awareness of darker impulses means becoming worse, when in fact it means becoming conscious, and consciousness always carries weight because it removes the comfort of denial. As the shadow is gradually integrated, relationships tend to change, because projection loses its grip, and traits once attributed entirely to others are recognized internally, reducing emotional reactivity and increasing personal responsibility without turning into self-blame. Conflicts no longer feel entirely external because the individual begins to see how their own unconscious material participates in situations they once experienced as purely imposed. creating a sense of agency that is uncomfortable but empowering. Meaning begins to reappear during this phase, not as certainty or optimism, but as coherence, because inner life becomes less fragmented, less dominated by unseen forces, and more aligned with conscious values that are no longer built on denial. Jung saw this alignment as fragile because it requires ongoing attention, and the temptation to retreat into the safety of the persona never fully disappears, especially when life becomes demanding or uncertain. Yet once the shadow has been glimpsed, it cannot be entirely unseen. And even partial awareness changes the relationship between the ego and the unconscious, reducing the likelihood that life will be driven by compulsions disguised as choices. Meeting the shadow without turning away does not resolve all inner conflict, because conflict is inherent to psychological life, but it transforms conflict from an invisible force into a conscious tension that can be carried rather than suffered. This capacity to carry tension, to remain present with discomfort, without rushing toward premature resolution, is central to Jung's understanding of meaning, because meaning is not found in harmony alone, but in the willingness to live honestly within contradiction. The individual who engages this work often becomes less certain but more grounded, less righteous but more responsible, and less driven by the need to appear good than by the desire to be whole, even when wholeness disrupts familiar identities. In Jung's view, this is the point at which life begins to feel personally owned rather than inherited, because choices are no longer dictated entirely by adaptation or fear, but informed by a deeper awareness of what one carries within. The shadow, once feared as a threat to identity, becomes a source of insight, revealing not only what has been denied, but why it was denied, and how much energy has been spent maintaining a version of the self that could not contain the full truth of one's experience. Meaning, at this stage, does not appear as an answer to life's questions, but as a shift in orientation, where the individual is no longer running from themselves, and where inner life becomes a place of dialogue rather than conflict, even when that dialogue remains unresolved. Because for Jung, the meaning of life is not discovered by eliminating darkness, but by bringing light into it, not to destroy what is found there, but to understand it well enough that it no longer needs to act from the shadows. Chapter 6. Why wholeness feels heavier than happiness. At some point in the process Jung described, a realization begins to take shape that is difficult to accept at first, which is that becoming more conscious does not make life lighter, clearer, or more pleasant in the way people often expect, but instead makes it denser, slower, and heavier, as though the weight of reality has increased now that fewer parts of it are being ignored. Many people unconsciously assume that self-understanding is meant to bring relief, that insight should dissolve tension, that awareness should simplify existence. Yet Jung observed the opposite pattern again and again, where greater psychological integration brings a deeper sense of responsibility, a sharper awareness of contradiction, and a reduced ability to hide behind comforting illusions. This is why wholeness is often mistaken for unhappiness, because it lacks the intoxication of simplicity. And once the psyche begins to integrate disowned parts, it becomes harder to divide the world cleanly into right and wrong, victim and villain, strength and weakness, which means the emotional shortcuts that once provided certainty no longer function in the same way. Happiness, as it is commonly pursued, tends to rely on narrowing awareness, on focusing selectively on what feels good, manageable, or affirming, while quietly excluding what disrupts the desired emotional state. And Jung did not condemn this impulse, because he understood it as a natural attempt to preserve psychological comfort. Wholeness, however, moves in the opposite direction, because it expands awareness rather than contracts it, bringing conflicting impulses, uncomfortable emotions, and unresolved tensions into the same psychological space, requiring the individual to carry more complexity internally instead of projecting it outward. This expansion often produces a sense of gravity, because the individual becomes less able to explain their suffering away, less able to assign blame exclusively to circumstances, and less able to cling to narratives that protect the ego from ambiguity. And this can feel like a loss rather than a gain. Jung noted that many people abandon the work of individuation at this stage, not because it is impossible, but because it conflicts with their unconscious expectation that growth should feel rewarding in a simple, emotional sense. And when it does not, they assume something has gone wrong. What has actually changed is not the quality of life itself, but the relationship to it, because the person is no longer anesthetized by denial, fantasy, or idealization. And as a result, joy and pain are both experienced more directly, without the buffers that once softened their impact. This is why the integrated individual often appears calmer but less euphoric, more grounded but less enthusiastic, because they are no longer chasing emotional highs as proof that life is meaningful, having learned that intensity is not the same as depth. Jung believed that happiness, when pursued as an end in itself, often functions as a defense against deeper psychological work, because it encourages the avoidance of grief, anger, fear, and doubt, all of which are essential signals within the psyche rather than obstacles to be eliminated. Wholeness does not remove these experiences, but places them in context, allowing them to exist without dominating the entire inner landscape. And this containment requires strength rather than optimism, endurance rather than excitement. As awareness deepens, the individual becomes increasingly conscious of their own participation in suffering, not in a self-blaming way, but in the recognition that life is not something that merely happens to them, and that their choices, reactions, and blind spots shape their experience more than they once believed. This realization can feel sobering because it removes the comfort of innocence, replacing it with responsibility. And responsibility carries weight precisely because it cannot be delegated to fate, society, or other people without distortion. Jung often emphasized that maturity is not marked by certainty, but by the ability to live with unanswered questions without rushing to premature conclusions. And this capacity requires psychological stamina because ambiguity is emotionally taxing when it cannot be resolved through simple narratives. The individual who moves toward wholeness must learn to tolerate internal tension, to hold opposing desires, values, and fears within the same psyche without needing to immediately choose one side and reject the other. And this inner holding creates a sense of heaviness that many mistake for regression. Yet Jung saw this heaviness as a sign of growth, because a psyche that can carry contradiction is more resilient than one that depends on clarity at all costs, even though it may feel less comfortable in the short term. As the illusion of effortless happiness fades, another quality begins to emerge slowly, which is a quieter, more durable sense of meaning that does not fluctuate dramatically with circumstances, because it is rooted in coherence rather than pleasure. This form of meaning does not eliminate suffering, but it contextualizes it, allowing pain to be experienced as part of a larger psychological movement, rather than as evidence that life has failed. And this shift changes the emotional texture of existence even when external conditions remain unchanged. Jung believed that many people confuse happiness with aliveness, assuming that a meaningful life must feel good most of the time, when in reality, a meaningful life often feels demanding because it requires conscious participation rather than passive consumption. The integrated individual becomes less dependent on external validation, not because they no longer care about others, but because their sense of worth is no longer entirely outsourced to approval, achievement, or admiration. And this internal anchoring reduces emotional volatility while increasing depth. This does not make life easier, but it makes it more honest, because the individual is no longer constantly negotiating their inner reality to maintain a particular emotional state, and instead allows experience to unfold with fewer distortions. Jung warned that people often resist this stage because it does not align with cultural ideals of success, happiness, or positivity, and because a person who values wholeness over happiness may appear less driven, less certain, or less impressive from the outside, even though their inner life has become more stable. The reward of this path is not constant satisfaction, but integrity, a sense that one's actions, values, and inner experience are no longer fundamentally at odds, even when life remains difficult or unresolved. As wholeness deepens, the individual becomes more patient with themselves and others, not because they excuse harmful behavior, but because they recognize how much of human action is driven by unconscious material rather than deliberate intent. And this recognition softens judgment without erasing accountability. Life at this stage often feels slower because reactions are less automatic, choices are more considered, and the urge to escape discomfort through distraction, fantasy, or impulsive action loses some of its urgency. Jung believed that this slowing is essential because meaning cannot be rushed, and a psyche that moves too quickly rarely integrates what it encounters, instead accumulating experiences without transformation. Wholeness, then, is not a peak state to be achieved, but a posture toward life, one that accepts complexity as unavoidable and contradiction as meaningful, even when neither can be resolved neatly. The heaviness that accompanies this posture is not a burden to be eliminated, but a weight to be carried consciously, because only what is carried can be transformed, and only what is transformed contributes to a sense of life that feels internally justified rather than externally impressive. In this sense, Jung saw wholeness not as an escape from suffering, but as a way of inhabiting it differently, with awareness instead of avoidance, and with responsibility instead of resentment. And although this path does not promise happiness in the way it is commonly imagined, it offers something more enduring, which is the feeling that one's life is being lived from the inside out, even when it is difficult, uncertain, or unresolved. And that, for Jung, is where meaning quietly takes root. Chapter 7. Suffering as a psychological signal. At some point, once the pursuit of happiness has loosened its grip and the work of wholeness has begun, suffering can no longer be dismissed as an accident, a punishment, or a meaningless interruption, because Carl Jung observed that psychological suffering often appears precisely when something important is being avoided, delayed, or misunderstood within the inner life. This does not mean that all suffering is chosen or deserved, nor that pain is somehow virtuous in itself, but rather that the psyche uses discomfort as a language, one that becomes louder when it is ignored and more disruptive when its message is consistently misunderstood. Modern life tends to treat suffering as a problem to be eliminated as quickly as possible, something to be numbed, medicated, distracted from, or reframed before it can leave a mark. Yet Jung noticed that when suffering is prematurely silenced, it often returns in a different form, more persistent and less intelligible than before. The psyche does not create suffering arbitrarily, because it is oriented toward balance rather than punishment. And when inner equilibrium is disturbed, symptoms emerge as attempts to restore movement, awareness, or integration that has stalled. This is why Jung viewed symptoms not merely as malfunctions, but as expressions, because anxiety, depression, compulsions, and recurring emotional pain often point toward conflicts that have not been consciously addressed, parts of the self that have been excluded, or life directions that have become misaligned with inner necessity. When suffering is approached only as something to be eradicated, its informational value is lost, and the individual may find themselves trapped in cycles of relief and relapse, where symptoms temporarily recede only to return with renewed intensity because the underlying psychological tension remains untouched. Jung believed that suffering becomes particularly intense when a person resists change that the psyche is demanding, because resistance requires energy, and that energy builds pressure internally, eventually expressing itself as emotional or psychological distress that cannot be explained away by circumstances alone. This is why people often experience suffering at moments of transition, even when those transitions appear positive from the outside, because the psyche is being asked to relinquish familiar identities, attachments, or narratives that once provided stability, and loss of the old is felt even when the new has not yet taken shape. Suffering, in this sense, is not evidence that life is going wrong, but that it is moving, and movement is inherently disruptive when it challenges structures that have kept the ego comfortable or secure. Jung was careful to distinguish between suffering that arises from unavoidable external conditions and suffering that is intensified by psychological resistance, because while not all pain can be transformed through awareness, much unnecessary suffering is created when individuals cling to identities, relationships, or beliefs that no longer reflect their inner reality. The psyche reacts strongly to this clinging because stagnation threatens its natural tendency toward development. And when growth is blocked, energy turns inward, manifesting as symptoms that feel personal but often carry a transpersonal quality, as though something larger than the ego is pressing for recognition. This is why Jung paid close attention to dreams, fantasies, and recurring inner images, because he believed these symbolic expressions often communicate what suffering cannot articulate directly, revealing themes of loss, conflict, or unrealized potential that the conscious mind has overlooked. Dreams frequently present suffering not as random chaos, but as meaningful imagery, repeating motifs that point toward unfinished psychological work. And when these images are ignored, the waking life often compensates through emotional distress that demands attention in a more disruptive way. Jung believed that meaning does not remove suffering, but it changes the way suffering is experienced, because pain that is understood as part of a developmental process feels fundamentally different from pain that appears arbitrary and senseless. When suffering is experienced as meaningless, it tends to isolate the individual, cutting them off from both others and themselves. Whereas when it is experienced as meaningful, even partially, it becomes something that can be endured, reflected upon, and integrated rather than merely escaped. This does not romanticize suffering, because Jung was clear that suffering in excess can be destructive, overwhelming, and psychologically damaging, particularly when it is prolonged without support or understanding. And he did not suggest that pain should be sought or glorified. Instead, He emphasized the importance of listening to suffering before attempting to silence it, because the impulse to immediately fix or numb discomfort often arises from fear rather than wisdom, and fear rarely leads to insight. Listening to suffering does not mean indulging it or identifying with it completely, because identification can turn pain into identity, trapping the individual in a narrative of victimhood that limits movement rather than facilitating it. Rather, listening means holding suffering in awareness, allowing it to exist without immediate judgment or escape, and asking what aspect of the psyche is being neglected, denied, or constrained by the current way of living. This question is rarely answered quickly, because suffering does not reveal its meaning on demand, and Jung warned against forcing interpretations too early, as premature explanations often reflect the ego's need for control rather than the psyche's deeper truth. Over time, however, patterns begin to emerge, because suffering tends to cluster around specific themes, relationships, or situations, revealing where psychic energy is blocked and where change is being resisted. As awareness grows, suffering often shifts in quality, becoming less chaotic and more specific, less overwhelming and more informative, because what is unconscious begins to move into relationship with consciousness. This shift does not eliminate pain, but it reduces its randomness, allowing the individual to recognize that their suffering is connected to their own life story rather than imposed entirely from outside. Jung believed that this recognition is crucial for meaning, because meaning cannot exist where experience feels entirely alien, and suffering that is owned, even partially, becomes something that can be worked with rather than something that merely happens. At this stage, the individual may notice that suffering deepens empathy, not as a moral virtue, but as a psychological consequence of having confronted one's own inner complexity, because awareness of one's own pain reduces the impulse to simplify or judge the pain of others. This does not make the individual passive or resigned, but more discerning about which struggles are worth engaging and which are perpetuated by unnecessary resistance or unrealistic expectations. Suffering, when understood as a signal, also clarifies values, because it reveals what matters enough to hurt. And Jung believed that what wounds us repeatedly often points toward what the psyche considers essential, even when the ego would prefer to avoid it. A person may suffer deeply over creative frustration, relational disconnection, or lack of purpose, not because they are weak, but because these areas touch the core of their psychological orientation, and ignoring them creates a sense of inner betrayal that manifests as pain. As this understanding matures, suffering becomes less about asking why this is happening to me, and more about asking what is being asked of me, not in a moral or heroic sense, but in a psychological one. This shift does not provide easy answers, because the psyche does not offer instructions, only directions, and following those directions often involves uncertainty, loss, and the dismantling of familiar structures. Yet Jung believed that suffering endured with awareness transforms the individual, not by making them superior, but by making them more real, more capable of holding complexity, and more resistant to the illusions that once promised comfort at the cost of authenticity. Meaning, at this point, does not eliminate pain, but it prevents suffering from becoming meaningless. And this distinction is crucial, because pain without meaning fractures the psyche, while pain with meaning, however incomplete, can be integrated into a coherent life narrative. For Jung, this integration is not about finding justification for suffering, but about allowing it to shape consciousness rather than destroy it. because what is not integrated tends to dominate from below, while what is integrated becomes part of a larger, more stable whole. Suffering, then, is not the opposite of meaning, but one of its primary pathways, not because pain is desirable, but because the psyche often requires friction to become aware of itself. And awareness is the foundation upon which meaning slowly forms. And while no one chooses this path deliberately, Jung believed that those who do not turn away from suffering, who remain present long enough to hear what it is pointing toward, often discover that their pain has been guiding them, imperfectly and painfully, toward a life that feels internally justified rather than merely endured. Chapter 8. Dreams, Symbols, and the Inner Voice. As conscious life becomes more honest and less defended, another dimension of experience begins to press forward. One that does not speak in logic, arguments, or clear instructions, but in images, fragments, emotions, and stories that feel oddly familiar, despite never having been consciously learned. And Carl Jung believed this dimension to be one of the most direct expressions of the psyche's deeper movement toward meaning. Jung observed that when the conscious mind loosens its grip on absolute control, the unconscious begins to respond, not by providing answers in the way the ego expects, but by communicating symbolically, using dreams, fantasies, recurring thoughts, and spontaneous images as its primary language. This symbolic communication often feels confusing at first, because modern consciousness is trained to value clarity, efficiency, and literal meaning, while symbols operate through resonance rather than explanation, conveying psychological truth through feeling and association rather than definition. Dreams, in particular, play a central role in this process, because during sleep, the ego's defenses are lowered, allowing unconscious material to surface without immediate censorship. And Jung took dreams seriously, not as predictions or random noise, but as meaningful expressions of the psyche's attempt to balance conscious attitudes. He noticed that dreams often compensate for what is missing in waking life, presenting qualities, emotions, or perspectives that the conscious personality has neglected, exaggerated, or denied. And in this way, dreams function as a kind of inner dialogue rather than a message to be decoded once and forgotten. For someone overly identified with control and rationality, dreams may appear chaotic, emotional, or irrational, while for someone consumed by emotion, dreams may introduce structure, distance, or reflection, revealing how the psyche seeks equilibrium rather than comfort. What makes this dialogue difficult is that symbols do not submit to simple interpretation, because their meaning is not fixed, and Jung warned against reducing symbols to rigid explanations, as doing so strips them of their psychological vitality. A symbol, in Jung's view, is alive precisely because it holds more meaning than the conscious mind can fully grasp, and its power lies in what it evokes rather than what it explains, making it a bridge between what is known and what is still becoming. This is why symbolic experiences often feel strangely significant even when they are not understood, because they touch layers of the psyche that predate rational thought, layers shaped by instinct, myth, and shared human patterns that Jung referred to as the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious does not replace personal experience, but underlies it, providing universal themes that surface in individual lives through dreams and symbols, such as journeys, deaths, rebirths, shadows, guides, and thresholds, all of which reflect stages of psychological transformation rather than literal events. Jung noticed that during periods of inner change, symbolic material intensifies, because the psyche is attempting to guide consciousness through territory that logic alone cannot navigate. And this guidance often appears indirect, ambiguous, and frustrating to the ego. A dream may repeat itself, an image may return obsessively, or a particular story may resonate deeply for reasons that are not immediately clear. And rather than demanding interpretation, Jung believed the task was to remain in relationship with these symbols long enough for their meaning to unfold organically. Remaining in relationship requires patience, because the ego's instinct is to either dismiss what it cannot understand or force it into a familiar framework, both of which interrupt the dialogue before it can mature. Jung emphasized that the inner voice does not shout, because it does not compete with external demands, and it does not persuade through urgency or fear, but waits, returning again and again through subtle means until it is either acknowledged or drowned out completely. This voice is not the voice of reason, nor the voice of morality, and it does not always align with social expectations or personal ambition, which is why it is so often ignored, because listening to it can feel destabilizing rather than reassuring. The inner voice tends to speak in terms of direction rather than destination, nudging the individual toward experiences, attitudes, or confrontations that feel necessary rather than desirable. And its guidance often involves letting go of familiar identities without offering clear replacements. Jung believed that meaning emerges when consciousness learns to listen to this voice without demanding certainty, because certainty belongs to the ego, while growth belongs to the psyche, and the two rarely move at the same pace. This listening does not mean obedience, because blind submission to inner impulses can be as destructive as complete repression, and Jung was clear that dialogue, not domination, is the goal, allowing conscious judgment and unconscious material to inform each other rather than compete. When this dialogue is established, symbols begin to lose their threatening quality because they are no longer experienced as alien intrusions, but as communications from a part of the self that has been excluded for too long. Dreams become less chaotic and more coherent, not because they are controlled, but because they are being heard, and the psyche no longer needs to exaggerate its message to break through resistance. Over time, the individual may notice that decisions feel less forced, not because they are easier, but because they align more closely with an inner direction that has been gradually clarified through symbolic engagement rather than rational planning. This alignment does not eliminate doubt, but it reduces inner conflict, because choices are no longer made solely to satisfy external demands or internal fears, but are informed by a deeper sense of psychological necessity. Jung believed that people who ignore symbolic life eventually experience a loss of meaning, because without symbols, experience becomes flat, literal, and disconnected from the deeper layers of the psyche that give life its sense of significance. Symbols are not decorative additions to life, but essential mediators between conscious awareness and unconscious depth. And when they are absent, the psyche loses one of its primary ways of orienting itself. This is why modern individuals, surrounded by information, yet starved of meaning, often feel disoriented, because their symbolic life has been replaced by explanation, analysis, and consumption, leaving little room for inner resonance. Re-engaging with symbols does not require belief in mysticism or mythology, but willingness to take inner experience seriously, to treat dreams, fantasies, and emotional images as meaningful expressions rather than as distractions or malfunctions. Jung encouraged people to record their dreams, reflect on recurring images, and notice which stories, myths, or artworks evoke strong emotional responses because these responses often reveal something about the psyche's current direction. The value lies not in decoding symbols once and for all, but in observing how they change over time, because as consciousness develops, the symbols that emerge evolve with it, reflecting shifts in inner orientation. Through this ongoing dialogue, the individual begins to sense an inner coherence that cannot be fully articulated, a feeling that life is moving in a direction that makes psychological sense even when it defies conventional logic or expectation. Meaning, in this context, does not arrive as a statement or conclusion, but as a lived relationship with inner experience, one that continues to unfold rather than resolve. Jung believed that ignoring this relationship leads to a kind of inner deafness, where the psyche continues to speak but consciousness no longer listens, resulting in life decisions that feel increasingly disconnected from inner truth. Listening, however imperfectly, restores communication, allowing the individual to feel guided rather than driven, oriented rather than scattered, even when the path ahead remains unclear. The inner voice does not promise safety, success, or happiness, but it offers something more subtle, which is a sense of psychological rightness, a feeling that one is moving in accordance with something real rather than merely reacting to pressure. And although this voice never speaks in complete sentences, never provides guarantees, and never resolves all doubt, Jung believed that learning to hear it is essential for a meaningful life, because meaning does not come from certainty, but from participation in the dialogue between what we know and what is still becoming. Chapter 9. Becoming whole rather than becoming perfect. As the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious deepens, a subtle but decisive shift begins to take place, one that is often misunderstood, because it does not resemble improvement in the conventional sense, nor does it align with cultural ideas of progress, self-optimization, or personal mastery. And Carl Jung believed that many people lose their way precisely because they mistake this shift for failure rather than development. From early life onward, most individuals are trained to pursue perfection, even if the word itself is never spoken, because perfection is implied through expectations, evaluations, and comparisons that reward consistency, control, and flawlessness, creating the impression that psychological health means eliminating contradiction rather than learning how to live with it. Perfection promises safety, because a perfected self appears predictable, admirable, and resistant to criticism, and the ego naturally gravitates toward this promise, believing that if it can just refine itself enough, suffering, conflict, and uncertainty will finally disappear. Jung observed that this pursuit, while understandable, is fundamentally incompatible with psychological wholeness, because perfection requires exclusion, while wholeness requires inclusion, and what is excluded does not vanish, but accumulates energy outside awareness, eventually disrupting the very stability perfection was meant to provide. The individual who strives for perfection often becomes increasingly brittle, not because they lack strength, but because their identity depends on maintaining a narrow self-image that cannot accommodate error, weakness, or contradiction without collapse. Wholeness, by contrast, expands identity rather than tightening it, allowing opposing qualities to coexist without immediately demanding resolution. And this coexistence creates internal tension that perfection actively avoids. Jung believed that this tension is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured, because growth occurs not through the elimination of conflict, but through sustained engagement with it. allowing something new to emerge over time. This is why becoming whole often feels like losing ground, because the clarity and confidence that came from rigid self-definitions begin to dissolve, replaced by ambiguity, self-questioning, and an awareness of limitation that can feel destabilizing. People at this stage may say they feel less certain of who they are, less confident in their judgments, and less motivated by external rewards. And from the perspective of a culture that values decisiveness and optimization, this can look like regression. Jung, however, saw it as maturation, because certainty often belongs to earlier stages of development, when identity must be stabilized quickly in order to function, while later stages require flexibility, nuance, and the capacity to tolerate not knowing. The ego resists this transition fiercely, because perfection offers control, while wholeness demands surrender. Not surrender to chaos, but surrender of the illusion that the self can be engineered into a flawless, final form. This surrender is deeply uncomfortable, because it exposes vulnerability without immediately compensating for it, removing the psychological armor that once provided confidence, even if that confidence was built on denial. Yet Jung believed that only through this exposure can the psyche reorganize itself around a more authentic center, because as long as identity is built on perfection, it remains dependent on constant reinforcement, approval, and performance. The individual who begins to value wholeness over perfection gradually shifts their orientation from appearance to experience, from control to relationship, and from outcome to process. Even though this shift often feels like standing on unstable ground, mistakes are no longer experienced solely as threats to identity, but as information, revealing where unconscious material is still active, where expectations are unrealistic, or where adaptation has overridden authenticity. This does not make failure pleasant, but it makes it meaningful, because each disruption becomes an opportunity for integration rather than a verdict on personal worth. Jung emphasized that wholeness does not mean harmony at all times, because harmony implies resolution, while wholeness implies containment, the ability to hold conflicting elements without needing to prematurely reconcile them. A person may feel both strong and afraid, both committed and uncertain, both loving and resentful. And instead of choosing one side to preserve a coherent self-image, they learn to acknowledge the reality of both. This acknowledgement reduces the energy wasted on suppression and rationalization, freeing psychological resources that were previously consumed by internal policing. And this liberation often brings a sense of quiet vitality that is less dramatic but more sustainable than the excitement of perfection. As this process continues, the individual becomes less invested in comparison, because comparison depends on simplified metrics, and wholeness resists simplification, making it difficult to measure oneself against others without distortion. Success and failure lose some of their emotional charge, not because they no longer matter, but because they are no longer the sole arbiters of value, having been placed within a broader context of psychological development. Jung believed that this reorientation is essential for meaning, because meaning cannot be sustained by external validation alone, and a life built entirely around achievement eventually collapses into emptiness once goals are reached or become unattainable. Becoming whole involves accepting that some questions will never be answered definitively, that some wounds will never fully heal, and that some desires will remain unfulfilled, not as signs of inadequacy, but as inherent aspects of being human. This acceptance is not because it does not prevent effort, growth, or aspiration, but it changes their emotional tone, replacing desperation with commitment and urgency with patience. The individual begins to act not to complete themselves, but to express themselves, not to erase deficiency, but to participate more fully in life as it is, including its limits. Jung saw this shift as the emergence of the self, a psychological center larger than the ego, one that organizes experience not around perfection, but around coherence, allowing the personality to function as a dynamic whole rather than a rigid structure. The self does not eliminate conflict, but provides a context in which conflict can be held without fragmentation. And this holding creates a sense of inner continuity even as circumstances change. At this stage, people often feel less driven to prove themselves and more inclined to live deliberately, choosing depth over speed, authenticity over approval, and integration over impression. This does not make life easier in a practical sense, but it makes it less internally divided, because actions are no longer taken primarily to maintain an image, but to respond honestly to what is required in the moment. Jung believed that many midlife crises stem from the collapse of the perfection project, when the ego can no longer sustain the illusion of limitless potential, forcing a reckoning with finitude that either leads to bitterness or to wholeness. Those who cling to perfection often become cynical or rigid, while those who accept limitation find a different kind of freedom, one grounded in realism rather than fantasy. Meaning, in this context, is no longer something to be achieved, but something that emerges from alignment between inner reality and outer life, even when that alignment requires compromise, sacrifice, or uncertainty. Becoming whole does not mean becoming complete, because completion implies finality, and Jung believed that psychological life remains unfinished until death, but wholeness allows the unfinished to be lived with integrity rather than anxiety. The individual who embraces this path may appear less impressive by conventional standards, but internally they experience a growing sense of congruence, because fewer parts of themselves are excluded from participation in life. This inclusion brings gravity, because carrying more of oneself requires strength, but it also brings stability, because identity no longer depends on maintaining a narrow ideal that reality constantly threatens. Jung believed that perfection is an ego fantasy, while wholeness is a psychological achievement, one that cannot be rushed, displayed, or finalized, but only lived, moment by moment, through ongoing dialogue with one's inner reality. And while this achievement does not promise happiness in its simplest form, it offers something more durable, which is the feeling that one's life, with all its contradictions and limitations, is being lived honestly, and that honesty, for Jung, is one of the deepest foundations upon which meaning can quietly rest. Chapter 10. Meaning as an ongoing becoming. At the end of this long inward movement, there is no final revelation waiting, no moment where life suddenly explains itself, because Carl Jung believed that meaning is not something discovered once and then possessed, but something that continues to unfold as long as the psyche remains alive, responsive, and willing to engage with what is emerging rather than clinging to what has already been defined. This idea is difficult to accept because the ego longs for resolution, for a point of arrival where uncertainty dissolves and effort can finally relax. Yet Jung observed that the desire for a final answer often marks the moment when psychological development stalls, because life itself does not move toward completion, but toward transformation. Meaning, in this sense, is not a destination, but a direction, and directions cannot be reached, only followed. which means that a meaningful life is one that remains in motion internally, even when outer circumstances appear stable or repetitive. The mistake many people make is believing that meaning should feel clear, solid, and reassuring, something that can be articulated confidently and defended intellectually. When in reality, Jung found that meaning often feels provisional, fragile, and difficult to explain because it belongs to experience rather than concept. A person may sense that their life feels meaningful without being able to justify it logically, just as they may feel empty despite meeting every external criterion for success. And this disconnect exists because meaning is not produced by achievement, coherence, or moral correctness alone, but by participation in one's own psychological unfolding. Jung believed that life constantly presents new material that demands integration, and what was meaningful at one stage may become restrictive at another, not because it was wrong, but because it has completed its function, making room for something that cannot yet be named. This is why people who rigidly define their meaning early in life often experience crisis later, because the psyche continues to develop even when identity refuses to adapt, creating tension between what is being lived and what is being insisted upon. Meaning, then, cannot be frozen into a belief system, a role, or a mission statement, because once meaning becomes static, it turns into ideology, and ideology, no matter how noble, eventually separates a person from their lived experience. Jung emphasized that psychological health depends on remaining responsive to change, not in the sense of chasing novelty, but in the sense of allowing inner reality to reshape outer life gradually, even when that reshaping disrupts comfort, identity, or long-held plans. This responsiveness requires humility, because it means accepting that the self one has built is not final, that one's understanding of life is incomplete, and that certainty is often a sign of unconsciousness rather than wisdom. The ego resists this humility because it experiences change as threat, and so it attempts to preserve meaning by clinging to familiar narratives, values, or identities long after they have lost vitality, mistaking stability for truth. Jung believed that this clinging is one of the primary sources of inner deadness, because when life is forced to conform to outdated meanings, energy drains away, leaving behind routine without resonance, commitment without conviction, and action without inner participation. A meaningful life, by contrast, remains permeable, open to revision, and willing to question itself, not compulsively, but honestly, recognizing that growth does not invalidate the past, but builds upon it. This does not mean living without commitment, because Jung was clear that meaning deepens through engagement rather than detachment, and a life lived tentatively, always hedging against change, rarely feels meaningful at all. The difference lies in committing to the process rather than to a fixed image of oneself, to the movement of becoming rather than to the preservation of a particular identity. This orientation allows a person to remain faithful to their inner development, even as circumstances shift, careers evolve, relationships change, and earlier ambitions lose relevance, because meaning is no longer tied to specific outcomes, but to the quality of engagement with life as it unfolds. Jung saw this quality as an attitude rather than a belief, an attitude of curiosity toward one's own experience, patience with inner contradictions, and respect for the psyche's timing, which rarely aligns with social expectations or personal plans. Such an attitude does not eliminate doubt, because doubt is intrinsic to growth, but it prevents doubt from turning into paralysis, because uncertainty is no longer interpreted as failure, but as a natural feature of a life that is still becoming. As people mature psychologically, they often become less concerned with defining their purpose and more concerned with living truthfully, because they have learned that purpose emerges through action rather than preceding it. This shift reduces the pressure to constantly evaluate whether life is meaningful, because meaning is no longer something to be measured or proven, but something that is felt intermittently, often in hindsight, through the recognition that one has responded honestly to what life has asked. Jung believed that meaning often becomes visible only when looking backward, because while living forward, the psyche is too immersed in experience to evaluate it objectively, and this delay protects the individual from premature conclusions that would interrupt development. This is why people who demand constant reassurance about the significance of their choices often undermine their own sense of meaning, because meaning requires time, continuity, and reflection to take shape. The ongoing nature of meaning also explains why suffering, uncertainty, and ambiguity never fully disappear, because they are not obstacles to meaning, but components of it, signals that the psyche is still engaged, still responsive, and still alive. A life without inner tension may feel comfortable, but it rarely feels meaningful, because meaning arises at the intersection of limitation and aspiration, where the individual must negotiate between what is possible and what is necessary. Jung believed that the psyche is oriented toward wholeness rather than happiness, and wholeness cannot be achieved without confronting loss, imperfection, and finitude, all of which remind the individual that life is not something to be mastered, but something to be lived. This living requires participation rather than observation, involvement rather than analysis, and commitment rather than certainty, even though commitment without certainty feels risky and exposes the individual to disappointment. Yet Jung saw this exposure as unavoidable, because a life protected from disappointment is also protected from depth, and depth is where meaning quietly resides. As the individual accepts that meaning is provisional and evolving, they become less obsessed with reaching a final state and more attentive to how they are living now, because the present moment is where becoming actually occurs. This attentiveness does not turn life into a series of peak experiences, but into a continuous process of adjustment, reflection, and response, where even ordinary moments carry significance because they participate in a larger psychological movement. Jung believed that this movement is guided by the self, not as a commanding authority, but as an organizing principle that draws disparate experiences into a coherent, though never complete, whole. The self does not dictate a life plan, but it provides orientation, a sense of direction that can be felt even when the path itself is unclear, allowing the individual to trust their movement without needing to justify it externally. Trust, in this context, does not mean confidence in outcomes, but confidence in the process, in the belief that responding honestly to inner experience, even imperfectly, contributes to a life that feels internally justified. This justification does not require recognition, approval, or validation from others, because it is experienced inwardly as coherence, as the feeling that one's actions are not fundamentally at odds with one's inner reality. Jung believed that when this coherence is present, life feels meaningful even in the absence of happiness, success, or certainty, because the individual senses that they are living in alignment with something real rather than chasing an abstraction. The tragedy, in Jung's view, is not that life contains suffering, ambiguity, and loss, but that many people never engage deeply enough with themselves to discover the meaning that could have emerged through these experiences. They remain busy, efficient, and functional, yet internally untouched, because they mistake motion for movement and achievement for development, never realizing that meaning cannot be added to life from the outside. Meaning must grow from within, shaped by the unique configuration of one's psyche, experiences, and choices. And because no two psyches are identical, no universal formula for meaning can exist. This uniqueness is not a burden, but an invitation, because it means that each life carries the potential for a meaning that has never existed before, one that can only be realized through that individual's willingness to engage with their own becoming. Jung did not promise that this engagement would lead to fulfillment in the conventional sense, but he believed it leads to a life that feels necessary rather than accidental, inhabited rather than endured. And perhaps this is the quiet conclusion Jung arrived at, not as a doctrine, but as an observation, which is that the meaning of life is not something life gives to us, but something that emerges as we allow ourselves to be shaped by it, moment by moment, without demanding that it resolve into certainty. Meaning lives in the ongoing conversation between who we have been, who we are, and who we are becoming. And as long as that conversation continues, life remains meaningful, not because it is complete, but because it is still unfolding.